Hey, Psych of Adjustment, how you guys doing today? And here we go. We got Rosie with us right now. So Rosie came to us. It was a very, very cold evening. It was a couple degrees below zero. I just come home from school. This is years ago, and we didn't even get above zero during the whole day. And Rosie had been hanging out on the porch for about a week, and on this particular day I came home. She moved in front of the door, sat there in front of the door, and she said, "Bring me inside now because I'm frickin' freezing." So that's how Rosie came to be in this house. And she's a pretty girl. I don't know if she's kind of hiding. Oh, there she is. So you can see her. All right, let's talk about relationships, right? And we're going to be talking about human-on-human relationships for the most part, not animal-human relationships, etc. So let us then do this thing. And of course, there's an assignment embedded in here for you guys, so let's look forward to that as well. What are we going to talk about? Well, like, love, romance, sex, this is all part of relationships, right? But let's begin with the attraction phase. Take it in order. That is, how do we become attracted to others? And notice it was easy to become attracted to Rosie because she has such a sweet disposition, but she's such a distinctive looking cat as well. And so we found her not as a complete kitten, but as a juvenile, I guess was her state. And I guess I made her angry, so now she's going to leave. Are you going to come back up here? Not so much. All right. Let's talk about attraction then, and three things that underlie initial attraction. Proximity is one. That is how close we are. So one predictor of potential attraction is we tend to be attracted to people we are closer to. And that might operate in conjunction with the second point here, that's familiarity. That is, the closer we are, the more familiar we can become. So to disentangle these two might be difficult. Physical attractiveness, okay, we're going to cover 2 points there, both the matching hypothesis and resource exchange as an explanation there. So let us begin then with the proximity effect, the single best predictor of attraction according to Leon Festinger, the man of cognitive dissonance, among other things, downward social comparisons. Single best factor, according to Festinger, is physical proximity or nearness. So where we live influences the friends we make. College students tend to date those who live either nearby or in the same type of housing as they do, with some simple studies that Festinger conducted back in the day. So that's nothing really. You say, okay, so that was really great. I'm glad you clued me into that. That's about as obvious as anything we can discuss. And I agree. So let's talk the mere exposure effect, and let's come from the opposite angle. This would be hard to anticipate. Contrary to folk wisdom, familiarity does not breed contempt. My first girlfriend, I remember very well, Carol. We were both 14. She was, maybe about a year older than I was. I was 14, maybe she was 15. And we had met in middle school, and in the summer between middle school and high school, Carol and I became boyfriend and girlfriend. And man, I spent like every waking moment I could that summer when I wasn't working with Carol, and vice versa. And I would come home from spending all day with Carol, and what I do, I would pick up the telephone and I would call Carol, and we would spend 2 or 3 hours on the telephone. And my grandmother would come by and she said, "Mark, you and Carol are going to get sick of each other. You need to give each other some space," right? Familiarity breeds contempt. Not necessarily. Grandma wisdom is not always empirically supported. So the more we're exposed to a stimulus, the more we come to like that stimulus. And Bob Zients is the one who developed this idea. Beach and Moreland took it into a more practical consideration or empirical demonstration. Notice we have a Chinese pictograph here. What did Zients do? Well, this is a famous experiment for Zients. This was such a big experiment that it bypassed all the psychology journals and went straight to the journal Science, right? Where the top findings across all sciences are published. So it's tough to get a psychology article in there because you're competing with chemistry, physics, and all the other sciences as well. What did he do? He brought people into the laboratory and he exposed them to 10 Chinese pictographs. And he chose Chinese pictographs for his American participants because he would assume that they'd never seen them before and certainly had no idea as to their meaning. Now, People were exposed to 10 of these repeatedly, flashing them on a computer screen, and he did it both subliminally, that is where people couldn't visibly detect them consciously, right, but non-conscious was processing them, and he did it also supraliminally where people could see them. Once the exposure aspect of the experiment was finished, then he gave the participant a sheet of paper that had 20 Chinese pictographs on it and said, please rate these on the level of your liking on a scale from 1 to 10, that famous scale of 1 to 10, right? What he found was the 10 that they'd been exposed to was on this list, but there were 10 novel that they had not been exposed to Chinese pictographs. What do you think? Well, they rated the ones that they'd been exposed to, and even subliminally exposed to, they rated them as liking them more than the ones they had not been exposed to. That was earth-shattering. No one really kind of believed that that could be true. A fascinating idea. What do Beach and Moreland do? Well, they take it and they pull it into the real world. They take a big lecture hall, Psych 1100 style lecture hall, 400 or 500 students, and they get 5 Confederates, 5 female Confederates, right? These are women who are pretending that they're enrolled in the class, and they are told, well, first of all, let's get this straight. They're all matched on attractiveness. So these are all very attractive women, young women, right? Rated 9 to 10, kind of identical in attractiveness. They are randomly assigned to show up. All of them show up on the first day. After the first day, only 4 come back, right? After 2 weeks, only 3 come back. So what we do is, what Beach and Moreland are doing is varying the length of exposure to each of these women who are considered equivalent. At the end of the course, then, there's a questionnaire passed out, much like Zientz's questionnaire with the Chinese pictographs, but as pictures of the 5 women. And it said, rate your liking of these 5 women, and the rankings fell in order to the amount of time they spent in class. Now note, they were instructed not to interact with anyone, so they merely showed up. Other students, participants, were merely exposed to their presence, right, with no interaction. This is fascinating, and this is where science is at its best, because science creates this very artificial laboratory paradigm that demonstrates the mere exposure effect and increases liking. But then Beach and Moreland try and make a real-world analog where they do it with human beings and exposure to each other. Now, Mita et al. Come at this from a different angle, but find or replicate in a consistent manner. Let's call it a conceptual replication. What they do is they take pictures of participants as they come into the lab. They take the participant's picture, and then they make 2 prints of the picture. Now, one is the straight on, but the other is they flip the negative or reverse the image, if you will, depending on what era we're talking in, and then show the participant the 2 pictures, and they say, what do you prefer? One is a straight-on image that other people would see. The other is the mirror image that the participant would be familiar with from looking at their own face in the mirror. What is your prediction? Which picture did the participants then prefer? You are correct if you said the mirror image, because the mirror image is the us that we're used to seeing. Most of us look at ourselves in the mirror, less so than photographs. Okay. So, solid contributions that establish mere exposure effect. And notice, this is morphed into product placement and a bunch of other phenomenon that are used in advertising. Okay? Now, we had to go on to point 3, the matching hypothesis. Now, I'm sure you've heard that, in fact, well, a couple things. People tend to look more like each other as couples age. They tend to resemble each other more and more. But that's not what we're talking about. That could be true or not. But what we find is, let's remember that scale on 1 to 10 regarding attractiveness. So, what we find is people tend to couple with people who are no more than 1 number away from them in attractiveness. So if you would consider me a 7, and that's probably being generous, right? What that means is that my partner is most likely to be a 6, 7, or an 8. That is within 1 number of me. And this is a pretty easy one to do. We can verify this by just looking at, we could do field study. We could look at couples walking down the street, have independent raters, rate them both on attractiveness, and find that the majority are within 1 point of each other. That's the matching hypothesis, right? And we see it through all these celebrity relationships, that are highly visible to us. But note that sometimes you say, well, no, because I've seen some instances where they're not a very close match. So if you want to then explain how is it that, let's say, a less attractive man, for example, garners the attention or the partnership of a very attractive woman, how does that occur? Well, that's probably better explained in terms of resource exchange. That is, one partner has something that the other partner wants, so the attractiveness doesn't come into it, doesn't enter into it, right? And we can see examples of that. And yes, this is an old picture, so I didn't just select this to be current or topical. This is going way back. Regardless, let us then move on and talk about things that increase liking. See, we went from attraction, what attracts us, but then what increases liking once we've been attracted? Well, reciprocal liking, and if we believe someone likes us, then we're more inclined to like them. And I remember in grade school, before partnering was a serious business, like in 6th grade, everyone's kind of just getting their feet wet on the idea of liking each other and passing notes, etc. And you say, wow, I want so-and-so to be my girlfriend, which doesn't mean a whole lot other than we declared girlfriend, boyfriend back in the day. I want Jean, I want to, tell Jean that I like her, but what if I tell her I like her and she says, well, I don't like you? So what would I do? To ensure the reciprocal liking, what would I do? Yeah, you're right. I would send out my spy. I would send out my spy and go see if Jean likes me. And my spy would report back, yeah, Jean likes you. So then I could declare my liking for Jean risk-free, so to speak. So reciprocal liking. Right? Similarity, let's take a look at this here on another slide in a minute. Endogamy is the tendency to marry within one's own social group, and especially within one's socioeconomic group. So this is kind of a historic kind of, but notice that it could also be a function of familiarity or proximity. Homogamy is a tendency to marry those who have similar personalities. Now, let's talk about similarity as a basis of attraction. And Byrne came along and said, I don't know that I buy it. I mean, yeah, people do in fact tend to gravitate towards people who are similar. But he says, I think the mechanism is more complex than that. He said, I think what comes first is we look at someone and we assess the level of dissimilarity. And if people, it's like we have a dissimilarity filter. And if people then, I look at someone and say, wow, they're really different than me, then I'm done. There is no further contact. But if they pass the dissimilarity filter, no, they're not dissimilar, then a second cognitive process takes place, which is to assess the level of similarity. So what does this look like? Well, I think we need a flow chart. People you meet. So here's this big group of people you meet. According to Byrne, the first question we ask is, are they dissimilar? And if the question is yes, this person is dissimilar, let's say they're rather troll-like, right? I say, yes, they're dissimilar, then I come off, and that means that I move into a behavior of avoidance, right? But notice, that's what comes first, is the dissimilarity filter. But let's do the other. Let's say, no, they are not dissimilar, so they pass the dissimilarity filter. The next filter, or the next evaluation that takes place, is how similar are they? And now notice, this is going to be answered by low or high. It's more of an evaluative judgment rather than a yes-no. So let's say, oh my God, look, there we are, college student. May not be the right college, right? And that does not look like Brutus. Actually, that's Pete, just in case you were wondering. Pete the Anteater. University of California, Irvine. What's the mascot? You got it, the Anteater. He said, oh my God, they have an anteater for a mascot. And I'm going to say like, yeah, and the Buckeyes have a poisonous nut as a mascot. So I don't know which is better or worse. I'll leave that to you to judge. But how similar? The similarity is low. Okay. Then indifference. I really don't give a care either way. But let's go the other way with our similarity filter. And what do we see? We see high similarity. Go Bucks. So this is where we get continued contact. Now, I think there's a lot to Byrne's model, and you can base it on your own experience as well, but dissimilarity is quite often a deal killer right out of the gate, right? So A lot to be said for Burns' idea. And it gave us a chance to exercise our flowcharting muscles. So, how many people have thought about childhood and childhood experiences as kind of a setup for how we partner up in adolescence and adulthood? And one domain which has received a bunch of attention in this regard is attachment. Quality of romantic relationship is linked to the quality of our attachment, emotional bond to caregivers during our infancy and childhood, caregivers such as our parents, right? So I know a lot of you have had child development or lifespan development, so you've talked some about attachment theory, and this is kind of how it plays out in relationships. Romantic partners give us a secure base to return to and obtain comfort from in stressful time, right? Notice, Mary Ainsworth's strange situation is testing the ability of the infant, or not the ability, but the propensity of the infant to view the caregiver as a secure base. That's a big part of the secure attachment, the strange situation. So, if we're securely attached to our parents, the idea is that we can securely attach to a partner later in life, right? So we learn that attachment style in infancy, and we use it as a model for our adult relationships. This is, I think, a fascinating area, because to what extent does the model of our parents' relationship inform us as to what to expect, what constitutes normal or expected relationships for ourselves in adulthood, right? So Mary Ainsworth identified 3 attachment styles between infant and caregiver, and then this has been expanded, I think, to a 4th. It's been modified, but let's go with the original. So she found secure attachment, and in her studies, about 70% infants demonstrated secure attachment, and that's the result of the caregiver being responsive to the infant's need. The infant develops trust in the caregiver, right, and learns to trust other people. Now, trust, that's an interesting acquisition, right? How do we acquire trust? What would Erik Erikson say? And notice, again, this is a process that takes place in infancy. And I always find it interesting when we have a psychologist like Ainsworth and Erikson, right? But they kind of converge on the same point, the importance of developing trust as an infant. Now, avoidant attachment style was observed in about 20%. Caregivers distant or rejecting. Infant suppresses the desire to be close to the caregiver because it's probably been inconsistent. So it's not, the infant isn't really able to use the parent as a secure base. And then ambivalent attachment style, the caregiver is probably inconsistent in their availability or overbearing with affection, right? Almost too smothering with affection at times. The infant clings anxiously to the caregiver, but then fights the closeness by pushing away. And this is, of course, what Mary Ainsworth's strange situation allowed her to observe and develop these. Now, what does that mean to adults? Well, Cindy Hayes and Philip Shaver examine continuity between childhood attachment and romantic relationships. And securely attached infants are more likely to have a secure attachment to an adult romantic partner. Now, how that occurs and the process through which that manifests itself is fascinating. Let's not go too far, but securely attached infants more likely to be securely attached partners, all else being equal. Right? Individuals with avoidant attachment styles in childhood find it difficult to develop intimate relationships in adulthood. And note, this is kind of consistent with Erikson, because if you don't develop the trust as an infant, when it gets time to the young adult phase, intimacy versus isolation, it becomes problematic because trust isn't part of the acquired values from infancy, according to Erikson. Now, all is not over, all is not lost. Individuals can revise attachment styles in adulthood. We can find the right person who opens our eyes to a whole new world of interpersonal relationship, and thus we move forward. Okay. Questions about that? I find it fascinating. The path from childhood to adulthood and how it matters, I think, is incredibly important. So, let's take a quick look at Sternbergs Triangle theory of love. What do we know? Sternberg suggests that, in fact, there are three basic types of love. That would be passion, intimacy, and commitment. You can see those are at the points of the triangle. Now, based on these three, intimacy, passion, and commitment, we can then make more complex types of love. 8 love combinations are possible according to Sternberg. Now, if you want to explore this further, I would love to see you in Psych of Emotion next semester. Hell, you could even write a paper on this in that class, reading the original Sternberg's work. And then you're going to extend it by applying emotions to each of these. But let's just take the simple part. If I'm feeling passion, and that's the heat, that's the arousal, that's the excitement, right? And then that leads me to want to get to know this person, and we start sharing our personal experiences, we share what's important to us. That's the intimacy part, is sharing. Now, physical, sexual intimacy can be a component of it, but I think what's more important here is the emotional and cognitive intimacy. So then, in a beginning relationship, a new relationship, high in passion, high in intimacy, and Sternberg's going to call that combination romantic love. But over time, what we see is, right, that the passion may begin to wane, but the commitment increases. We become a solid, we get married or whatever, and we see romantic love maybe shift towards companionate love. In many relationships, that would be the expectation. Where there's a huge level of intimacy and total commitment, but the passion has waned to a certain degree, and often that's the challenge in relationships, is how do we keep the heat, how do we keep the arousal, right? And for those of you, self-help book-wise, man, there's probably going to be a dozen self-help books devoted to injecting the passion back in the marriage, right? Whether, I hope by now you have the idea that self-help books can vary widely in their ability to accurately explain our worlds. Now, fatuous love down here at the bottom is where we got passion and commitment, but no intimacy. And maybe this is personified by the friends with benefit kind of thing. That we're committed to each other, we're passionate, but as far as the intimacy thing, not really going to go there. And then consummate love, ultimate love, according to Sternberg, all components combine intimacy, commitment, passion to create this wonderful thing. I don't know if you want to call it the unicorn of relationships, maybe. Unicorn's a popular term now, into consummate love. Okay, part 1, let's close it out. Let's move to part 2.